Gestures, facial expressions, and bodily movement. These are the nonverbals of our speeches. And there's really nothing more powerful than well done nonverbal communication. We can say a lot of great things and we can find the right words to do that. But to really take it to the next level, we can use our nonverbal communication to connect with people, and they may not even realize that there's a connection being made. But if we're using our nonverbals well, then we're doing a lot of communicating, and it's making a major impact on our audience. Now, unfortunately, what happens is the gestures, facial expressions, and bodily movement tend to get neglected in favor of the construction of our speech, the information that we want to present, doing our presentation aids. All those things are very important and should get a lot of our attention. But that doesn't mean that we should neglect our nonverbals, because we're really not tapping into that major resource that nonverbal communication gives us if we fail to incorporate these things in our speeches. There are a couple of things just to keep in mind as we're trying to figure out ways of employing our gestures, our facial expressions. And when I talk about movement, I mean movement of the whole body, where you see somebody actually moving in space, rather than just using gestures, which are a set of movement. So the first thing that we want to keep in mind is that we want to minimize gestures or facial expressions or movements that can be distracting, meaning they don't really serve a purpose. They're more things that we get into habits of doing, and they detract from our message because of that. People focus in on those things instead of what we're saying and how we're saying it. So we want to minimize those distractions. And then we want to maximize the purposeful use of our gestures, expressions, and movement. And that means that we have a reason for using those gestures and those movements and those expressions. It's not just randomly done. So you want to be able to connect these things to what you're saying. And there's just a fabulous Toastmasters speech that uses all of these things to just pull in the audience, and the impact is wonderful. You can just see this guy getting into the stories that he's telling. He does it not just with his nonverbals, but his tone and his facial expressions are wonderful. His movement is there, and his gestures are great, and you just get into that story with him because he's embodying what it's all about. It's not just talking about the stories, it's actually showing the stories with the nonverbals. And we can use these nonverbals in less demonstrative ways as well. There's a speech from Neil deGrasse Tyson, a NASA scientist, and you can see that he's using gestures and facial expressions and a little bit of movement to provide some emphasis in sort of the same way that the Toastmasters speech does, but he's a little more controlled with them. And as a result, it's not quite as lively, but it still adds impact to what he's saying. And then there's actually another Toastmasters speech where you get the same idea, where a lot of movement, some facial expressions, and the gestures really go in line with what the speaker is saying. And that's the key thing. We want those purposeful uses of gestures, facial expressions, and movement, which means that they're connected with what we're saying.